Hello, my History 125 students. This is Professor Donald Earl Collins with your Week 4 lecture and revised assignment speakings, talkings, things to talk about regarding that assignment since you have a new Week 4 assignment that we haven't offered before. So talk about a little bit, talk about your Week 4 lecture at the same time. Um, for this course, week four is really a transition. It transitions from looking at the real big themes around nonlinear progress and around cultural diffusion, with Europe as sort of a central figure, to just Europe as a central figure in the development of science and technology over time. The 16th century really is the period from which science takes off. The Renaissance is known for advancements in everything science, technology, music, etc., etc. But truly, the first century of the Renaissance, which is around the late 14th and through most of the 15th century, can be seen as mostly about art and architecture, right? Obviously, mathematics is involved in both, linear perspective and all that, map making and that sort of thing, even the printing press. But the 15th century, in terms of applying trial and error, the basis of formulating a hypothesis and testing it out and making sure that that hypothesis tests out as replicable time and time and time again, is where the real scientific revolution begins to take hold in the period roughly between the early 16th century and the end of the 17th century. So anywhere between, say, 1520 and 1690 or so is when the scientific revolution fully takes hold. And that revolution coincides with the rise of nation states and the declining power of the Roman Catholic Church, and for that matter, the Greek Orthodox Church. And why are those two things important? You can't spread scientific ideas if the main place from which those ideas spring suppresses them. It's literally that simple. I mean, if you learned anything from your readings for weeks 2 and especially week 3, is how central the power of the church is around issues of scientific and technological spread. They didn't want Arabic numerals to spread in the 12th and 13th centuries because they saw it as being heretic language, being the devil's language for mathematics, because it came from the infidel Muslim scholars, Islamic scholars. So as far as they were concerned, this is infidel stuff and therefore satanic. So that gives you some sense of what we're talking about here, right? Same thing to some extent with the printing press. So your readings primarily deal with two key players in this process. Um, Copernicus and Isaac Newton. But Nicholas Copernicus and Isaac Newton are among several people. Johannes Kepler, Tycho Brahe, um, among several people, and of course Galileo, for for which they're the main players or among the main men involved in the scientific revolution. Do not assume these are the only people, please. There are probably women involved too, whose names have been lost to history or at least obscured by the people who write history, who typically happen to be guys, right? But that's a story for another class, a class probably on the history of sexism and misogyny in Western culture or something like that. This is the wrong course for that. But the point is that there's a lot to be left out. And so really, the main theme for this week is, how does the scientific revolution overcome um, essentially not superstition, although if you're an atheist, I guess anything revolving around religion is superstitious, but certainly the power of the Roman Catholic Church in particular. And you need context for that. Now, normally, before UMGC took away our ability to share readings outside of required readings for class, I would give you that context. The context of the Protestant Reformation is key to understanding the relationship between the scientific revolution and the declining power of the church. If Martin Luther doesn't have a printing press for which to print out his 95 Theses, then nail them to his church in Bavaria in Europe, and then have that 95 Theses spread across Central and Western Europe over the course of the first half of the 16th century, there's no Protestant Reformation. He's probably excommunicated from the church. He might even be hunted down by the church and brought to one of their inquisitions um, in Rome or in Spain and then executed, right? But nope. Instead, he has the protection of his local duke or duce or baron, and he has the protection of other folks who believe that what he's saying is correct. The church is in fact corrupt. That it's selling sacraments so that people can basically buy their way to salvation and those kinds of things. So, it's being run by the Borgias and by the Medicis, and they're both very corrupt families. So all of that's involved, entangled in the Protestant Reformation. What's that have to do with the scientific revolution? Well, at the same time this is occurring, there's also the time where folks are playing around the scientific method to this sort of hypothesis, trial and error, replicability, seeing that the same hypothesis is correct over and over again, so that then it becomes theory, and theory gets published, and once theory is accepted by the general scientific community or larger society, then it becomes fact, right? People say the theory of evolution is just a theory, but most people accept portions of that theory, then it's actually a fact. It's no longer a theory, just as a for instance. And so in particular, mathematics and astronomy are involved. And why astronomy and mathematics? Because the church is basically claiming to be the representatives of heaven, right? And heaven, as the church depicts it, is basically this Greek Aristotelian way of thinking about heaven, which is the earth is the center of the universe, right? It's not just the center of the solar system, the center of the universe. Everything revolves around the earth, which is extremely narcissistic if you really think about it. Wow, we think that we're the what, and everything revolves around us. The sun revolves around us, the stars revolve around us, right, etc., etc. But starting with Brocchi, working your way to starting with Copernicus, working your way to Tycho Brocchi, working your way to Galileo, and then working your way to excuse me, Kepler and Isaac Newton over the course of 2 centuries. Better and better calculations, better and better technologies for which to actually measure movements of the heavens, movements of stars, movements of planets, movements of asteroids, even movements of several moons. Telescope being one of those great inventions, right? Folks were able to figure out by the latter half of the 16th century, and certainly by the time Galileo did his calculations in 1611, lo and behold, the Earth isn't the center of the universe. As far as the solar system is concerned, the sun is the center of the universe, and everything revolves around the sun. And the motions of the planets kind of support that. You can't calculate the motions of the planets and be accurate without actually accounting for the fact that the sun is the center of the solar system. And as far as they were concerned, the center of the universe, since they really couldn't measure anything outside the solar system at this point. Now, Galileo tried to publish these findings, but since Galileo was also, Galileo's work I think he worked at the time at the University of Pisa. Do not quote me on that. You can look that up yourselves. Those are institutions that are funded by the church. And since the church kind of controls how you distribute knowledge at this point, and specifically in Italy, they're saying, no, you can't publish. You're going to have to, you go ahead and, after he publishes, no, you're wrong. We should bring you in front of this committee. So he writes letters, including to one Duchess, Duchess saying in so many words, the quotes that you have for one of your questions for week 4 around, if God gave us minds to think, essentially, then why can't we use those minds to prove to prove things, right? And if we're proving things, that doesn't negate that God exists. If anything, it proves that God gave us minds in order to think through science. In so many words, he's saying God's telling us, the Bible tells us what God did. We're just trying to figure out how God did it in so many words. That's what he's saying to the duchess. Please support me against the church. So the church eventually backed down and said, okay, go ahead and publish your stuff, right? And then there was a more favorable pope and said, okay, Galileo, continue your work. Galileo continues his work and tries to, and fuming about what the church did in order to stop his work, writes a set of allegories. Allegories in which he makes fun of the church, makes light of their stupidity and willful ignorance, um, in showing that they're wrong about Earth being the center of the universe, and that in fact it's the sun, and so on and so forth. It worked out for a while, but when a new pope came in and saw what he wrote, that's when his second inquisition began, and it went all the way. He eventually recanted his work in 1632, was put on permanent house arrest, and whatever could be destroyed of his works in Italy were destroyed. However, he had friends, and he had friends both in the Protestant community, particularly scientists, who helped distribute his work. The printing press helped with that. The fact that there was a Protestant Reformation helped with this, and by this time, a good portion of Europe is Protestant. A good portion of what is now Germany is Protestant. There are Protestant groups in France. England is Protestant. Most of the UK, England in particular is Protestant. Wales is Protestant. Netherlands is Protestant. Those places are where his ideas spread and are preserved. And that is key to understanding how the church declines, the rise of nation states. Nation states that are not beholden to the Pope, beholden to the Roman Catholic Church, breaking away from the Roman Catholic Church. That's what helps Galileo distribute his work. It's what helps folks like Newton flourish later on in the 17th century, and a host of other people as well. Also, that doesn't get talked about a lot is the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War lasts from 1618 to 1648. And over the course of those 30 or so years, Catholic forces clash with Roman Catholic forces over over basically the control of nation states and the control of religion within those nation states. The Catholic forces lose. They lose, particularly in Central Europe, in West Central Europe. They lose, and as a result of them losing, the church's role declines. And mind you, the church is always dependent on other kings, other duchesses and dukes, other barons, other folks to defend it. If more and more kings and princes and dukes and duchesses realize that church doesn't really have any power unless we give it power, and then there's over time there's just going to be a decline. Doesn't mean that people aren't superstitious, that everyone believes that science triumphs over religion. That's not really what happens here. What happens here is that nation states take over the role of the Roman Catholic Church with regard to religion in a lot of cases, and that allows for more freedom, including the freedom to express yourself in terms of ideas. And so science and religion finally break apart as a result of the 30 Years' War, the rise of nation states, and the Protestant Reformation in general. That is basically this week in a nutshell. Okay, I'm going to transition fairly quickly to your annotated bibliographies, which are due at the end of week 4. As I said to those of you who happen to be on with me in Zoom for week 3 in my summer course, or in general, in a week, on announcements, I'm not expecting you to follow these guidelines of writing 250 to 300 words per source on the scientific innovation that's been in use prior to 1980 per source. Some of your sources don't lend themselves to 250 to 300 words. So, and sometimes, not all the time, you guys tend to think brevity is good. It's not always good. But in this case, being concise is good. Being able to say in a sentence or two what an article or a book is about, what a film is about, and how this relates to the particular technology you want to talk about across 5 different sources, right? So 150 to 300 words is what I'm looking for. right? Minimum of 150. Don't go over 300. Try to be concise, but don't try to go for such brevity that you're not really addressing what this source is saying about your particular invention. If you happen to be doing, for instance, alternating current, and you're reading the Popular Mechanics magazine article, I don't expect 300 words. It's Popular Mechanics, right? The article should be fairly short and sweet. If it's a journal article that basically details the fight between Tesla and Edison over electricity, then that probably is more of a 300-word variety. So there's that. Please follow Chicago style guidelines to the letter, right? You have in content, you go through course resources. There's resources on how to do Chicago style. My preference would be something other than Chicago style, probably APA, probably a modified Chicago style where you get to use parenthetical citations, but UMUC has said they want you to do Chicago style, so that's in the annotative process. That's not too difficult to do, right? Follow those guidelines. You should be fine. If you have any questions about those, email me. We could also talk about it during class discussion if we're doing hybrid class discussion online or in classrooms throughout the week. But if not, just email me, right? Depending on whether this is a summer course or some other course. So let's do that. So really what I'm expecting is, tell me what the article's about, what the author is trying to say in the article, what their argument is in terms of the uses of this technology, whether it's good, whether it's bad, whether it's a combination, that sort of thing. And any observations you might have that tie it to a larger theme around this particular piece of technology, right? How good it was for the world, how it advanced society. You might, for a little bit extra, you can talk about how credible this source is, whether or not this source is useful or not. Hopefully all of your sources are credible, but if you find something that you think is a little on the incredible side, you probably should mention that. But again, 150 to 300 words, I'm not expecting 250 to 300. So that for 5 sources, that totals between 750 and 1,500 words. If you end up somewhere in that ballpark, you'll all be fine. I don't really have anything else to add around that, but I just want to make sure you understand that this is what the expectations I have of you are for this assignment. Please email me if any of you have any questions.